the upkeep on Graceland terribly draining on the estate?
Very much so. Absolutely. This has been a major point.
The news did not arrive with fanfare. It slipped into people's phones and timelines like a quiet alarm, a simple statement from Graceland with one name that froze everyone who saw it: Elvis Presley. An official announcement about his tomb. For millions of fans, that was not just another update. It felt like someone had touched something sacred. Across the world, mornings and evenings stopped for a moment. In a small apartment in Germany, a woman who saved for years to visit Memphis read the headline twice before tears started. In Brazil, a man who plays Elvis songs at his street stall turned the music down to read in silence. All over the United States, in towns Elvis never visited, there were people who still felt like this message was about a member of their own family. At first glance, the announcement did not sound long, just a few paragraphs. Carefully written, signed in the calm voice that big estates use when they talk about big decisions. No drama in the wording. Yet, by the end of that short text, something about the way the world could visit Elvis Presley had changed. What shook people was not only what the statement said, but what it seemed to whisper underneath. Fans have walked past those iron gates, carrying flowers, cameras, vinyl records, sometimes nothing but their own grief. They moved down that path in the early morning light of Elvis Week, candles burning, songs floating on the air like prayers. The meditation garden, with Elvis's tomb at its heart, became the closest thing many of them ever had to standing next to him. For some, touching the cool stone of his grave was the moment they had spent a lifetime moving toward. They stood there and thought of childhood bedrooms with posters on the wall, of parents who played his records every Sunday, of the first time they heard that he was gone. The tomb was not just marble and letters in gold. It was proof that he had lived and that his story ended on that patch of ground in Memphis. This is why a single announcement could bring so many to tears. The statement did not just talk about preservation and security. It carried a heavier question that fans have been afraid to ask out loud. How long can a place this open, this personal, this fragile, stay the same? And how many millions can walk past a family's graves before the ground begins to show the weight of devotion? Online, reactions moved from confusion to fear. Were they closing the garden? Were they changing who could go there? Were they planning something more permanent, something that could never be undone? People searched for details, for hidden lines, for comfort between the sentences. To understand why this message cuts so deep, you have to understand what lies beneath those flowers and tiles, and how much pain and love were poured into this garden before the first tour group arrived. Elvis did not begin his rest where he lies now. His family faced a nightmare that almost took his body away from them and from Memphis forever. Before you can grasp why this new announcement matters so much, you have to go back to the night Elvis died, to the first place he was buried, and to the dark plot that forced his father to make a decision that changed the history of Graceland. Only then does the weight of a few new lines about his tomb make sense, and only then do the tears you see today begin to tell their story. In August of 1977, Memphis felt heavier than the summer heat alone could explain. The news of Elvis Presley's death moved like a shockwave, spilling out of radios, televisions, and diner conversations until it seemed that the entire world was leaning toward one house on Elvis Presley Boulevard. Inside that house, Vernon Presley moved through the days like a man trying to breathe underwater. Every sound felt wrong. Every room reminded him of his boy. When it came time to bury Elvis, the family did not immediately turn to the idea of Graceland. They followed tradition. Elvis was laid to rest at Forest Hill Cemetery, the same cemetery where his beloved mother Gladys had been buried years earlier. For Vernon, there was a dark, quiet comfort in that choice. Mother and son together in consecrated ground, away from the noise and the cameras, guarded by ordinary fences and headstones rather than the curiosity of strangers. The funeral drew crowds that stretched belief. Thousands outside, a carefully controlled few inside, and a press that could not look away. Once the casket was lowered and the dirt was settled, the world was expected to move on to its next headline. In theory, Elvis would finally have the peace that had escaped him in life. In reality, that peace lasted only a short while. In the weeks that followed, fans kept arriving at Forest Hill. Some came to stand at the gates. Others managed to get close enough to leave flowers at his grave. Grief has its own gravity, and this grave pulled at people who had never met him but felt as if they had grown up with him in their living rooms. Vernon understood that. He knew what it meant to need a place to visit, a place to stand and say the things you never managed to say aloud when someone was still alive. Then came the night that tore the illusion of safety apart. A group of men formed a plan that sounded like something out of a nightmare. They intended to break into the cemetery and steal Elvis Presley's body. It was not about love, or mourning, or respect. It was about money, leverage, and the twisted power that comes from holding something sacred hostage. Law enforcement stepped in. The plan failed, no grave was opened, no body was taken. On paper, it was a foiled crime. For Vernon, it was a horror that lodged itself in his chest. The idea that someone could look at his son's resting place and see opportunity rather than a grave was almost more than he could stand. Elvis had spent his life overwhelmed by the demands of fame. Now, even in death, he was not safe. That was the moment when the first burial at Forest Hill stopped feeling like a resting place and started feeling like a risk. The cemetery was not built for this kind of attention. Vernon had to ask himself a question no parent should ever face. Leave his boy where he was, with his mother, vulnerable to anyone bold enough to jump a fence, or move him somewhere that might finally give him the protection his fame had always denied. In those long, sleepless hours, the answer began to form. Graceland had always been more than a house. It was the dream that Elvis had built out of poverty and possibility, the place where he laughed, paced, prayed, and fell apart. It was also a fortress with controlled gates, loyal staff, and security that understood exactly what was at stake. If Elvis were brought home, there would be eyes on him day and night. The decision was made. Elvis would be moved from Forest Hill to Graceland alongside Gladys. It was not a simple transfer. It was a statement. The heart of the Presley story would no longer be split between a public cemetery and a private estate. It would be united on the land that Elvis had poured his life into. Designing the meditation garden was not just a matter of stone and landscaping. The family and planners stood on the grounds and searched for a place that felt right, a place where the noise of the city softened and the house seemed to watch over its owner. A fountain was added, water constantly moving like a quiet hymn. Paths were laid so visitors could walk past in a slow, natural flow. The tombstone was positioned so that when you read his name, you felt the house at your back and the sky above you. When the first fans began to file through, something subtle shifted. They were no longer visiting a grave hidden in a distant cemetery. They were stepping inside Elvis's world, walking the same ground he had walked, then ending that journey in front of the stone that carried his name. Some stood frozen, some whispered, some wept openly. The garden, once a private decision for a broken father, became a living ritual for strangers from every corner of the globe. For Vernon, it was a complicated kind of comfort. He watched people mourn his son in ways that were both deeply touching and almost unbearable. Elvis was his boy before he was their idol. Yet now, his grave belonged to both of them. From the very beginning, that garden had to carry two identities that pulled in opposite directions. It was a family's resting place and a worldwide shrine. The question that lingered in the air, unspoken but always present, was how long any place could survive being both. From the outside, it looked like Graceland settled into its new role quietly. Elvis was home. The meditation garden was complete. Fans walked past in a steady line, heads bowed, hands clutching flowers and cameras. Inside the house, though, another story was unfolding. The estate was running out of money. In the early 80s, the numbers on the ledger started to look frightening. Taxes, maintenance, staff, security, legal fees, everything cost more than the world imagined. Records still sold, but not like they once had. Film, deals, and merchandise brought in money, but not enough to hold back the tide. For a moment, there were whispers that this house might actually have to close, that the gates might one day lock for good. That is when a different kind of decision was made. Graceland would open not as a private home, but as a museum and a living memorial. People would be invited in, guided room by room through the story of Elvis Presley, then led down toward the garden where he lay. It was a bold move, and for some in the family, it felt almost unthinkable. Yet the alternative, losing the house, losing the place that held his memory, was worse. When the doors finally opened, fans did not just show up, they poured in. Year after year, they kept coming, turning this private southern mansion into one of the most visited homes in the United States. The tour ended where it had to end. Down the path, past the fountain, standing before the stone that bore his name. The meditation garden became the quiet final chapter of every visit. The moment when the noise of the tour dropped away and people simply stood and felt. As the years went on, the garden changed in ways that were both subtle and heartbreaking. Elvis was not the only Presley there. His mother Gladys, his father Vernon, his grandmother Minnie Mae, the family that had carried him from poverty to worldwide fame, rested alongside him. The garden grew into a small circle of stones that told an entire family history in names and dates. For many fans, that only deepened the emotional weight of the place. They were no longer walking toward a single star's grave. They were entering the story of a family that had risen, broken, and buried its dead in one shared piece of ground. The tomb stopped being just a shrine to a singer. It became a symbol of everything that Dream had cost. Behind the scenes, the people running the estate carried Vernon's legacy forward. He had not lived to see the tours and the candlelight vigils stretch into decades, but the structure he set in place gave others the authority to protect what he left behind. Executives, lawyers, and family members worked together to keep the property profitable enough to survive. That meant business deals, licensing arrangements, and partnerships that sometimes made fans uneasy. Every time a new corporation bought into Elvis Presley's name or into Graceland itself, the same questions rose like a tide. Would the character of the place change? Would the meditation garden stay open the way it always had? Would some distant boardroom decide that the graves needed to be moved, restricted, or turned into something more controlled and less human? Rumors spread quickly. A headline here, a whisper there, an offhand comment from someone who said they heard something from an employee. Fans clung to any reassurance they could get. The graves, they were told, were not going anywhere. The garden would remain sacred ground. Yet those reassurances came against the backdrop of a world that kept shifting, a world where almost everything seemed to have a price. Then came the loss no one was ready to face. Lisa Marie Presley's death sent a fresh shock through the community. She was not just Elvis's daughter. She was, for many fans, the living bridge between the man they adored and the present day. When she was laid to rest near her father, the garden transformed once again. It was no longer only the story of a son and his parents. It was a multi-generational graveyard, carrying the weight of a family that kept being asked to say goodbye. Standing there now, visitors see more than a single name. They see Elvis, Gladys, Vernon, Minnie Mae, Benjamin, Lisa Marie. Each stone represents a new layer of loss. Every step along the path feels heavier than it did in the early years, because the garden has become the final chapter for more than one life. All the while, the practical strain grew. Millions of footsteps wore down the paths. Years of hands reaching out left their mark on the stone and railings. Security teams watched endlessly, knowing that one reckless act could damage something that could never be replaced. Quiet conversations began behind closed doors. How much longer could this much access be offered? How do you protect a place that people feel entitled to touch? Those questions did not have easy answers. Still, they lingered, circling above every meeting and every maintenance report. With each passing year, the pressure around that small garden increased until it was clear that one day a new decision would be unavoidable. The announcement that stunned fans around the world was not born overnight. It was the result of decades of grief, devotion, business, and fear building up around a few graves under Memphis sky. In the end, the announcement that shook so many people was not long, but every line carried years of pressure behind it. Graceland explained that the meditation garden and the Presley graves would enter a new phase of protection. Preservation work would begin, security would tighten, and the way visitors move through that space would change. Fans who had once been able to stand just a few steps from Elvis's tomb would now be held a little further back. The stone that had felt almost within reach would become something you looked at rather than something you could lean toward. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. The statement talked about weather, age, and the strain of millions of visitors. It reminded people that this was not only a tourist stop, but a family cemetery. There was mention of new legal protections too, a way of saying that these graves would not be moved, bought, or tampered with no matter how many times the business around them changed hands. On paper, it was a promise to guard the very thing fans have feared losing for decades. Yet those lines landed like a goodbye. For many who had already made the journey, it felt like the closing of a chapter they had been lucky enough to live through. They remembered early mornings when staff quietly allowed them to stand a little longer, to whisper a prayer, to place a hand on the low wall and feel that strange sense of closeness. Knowing that future visitors might never experience the garden in the same way stung in a place in that simple logic could not reach. Newer fans felt something different, a sense of being late to a party that was ending. They grew up with grainy footage of candlelight vigils, with stories from parents and grandparents who described walking right up to the stone. Now they read of barriers, guided flow, preservation zones. The garden they had pictured in their minds still existed, but it would not greet them in quite the same way. From the estate's side, the message tried to explain that there was no malice here, only necessity. Stones do not last forever when millions of hands and eyes and footsteps pour over them year after year. Paths crack, railings loosen, names carved into marble begin to soften from touch and time. Security teams have seen what most visitors have not: the rare person who forgets where they are and tests how far the rules will bend. In a world that has grown more unpredictable, the risk around such a famous graveyard has quietly climbed higher. There was another layer that made the announcement hit even harder. Along with the practical updates, the statement included words from the family that fans had never seen set out this way before. A short passage drawn from Mon or something Lisa Marie once said about her father, or from a private letter not now prepared to be inscribed or displayed as part of the garden's future. Those words did not speak about Elvis the superstar. They spoke about a father who cracked jokes, a man who paced the floor at night, a son who never quite got over losing his own mother. Reading that, people felt the ground shift under them. The tomb stopped being only a place where the world mourned a legend. It became, even more clearly, the center of a family's grief, a place where one heartbreak led into another until an entire line of stones told the story. That is what brought many to tears more than any metal rail or preservation plan. The announcement reminded everyone that this was never just theirs. It belonged first to people who lost a son, a husband, a father, and then lost each other in the years that followed. So the tears you see today come from two directions at once. One part is selfish in the most human way. People are mourning the loss of a kind of access that made them feel close to someone they never met. The other part is something softer. There is a strange comfort in knowing that after all the sales, all the contracts, all the noise around Elvis Presley's name, someone has drawn a firm circle around this small piece of ground and said, "This will be protected." In a sense, the new rules do not close his story. They acknowledge that time has moved on, that the first generation of fans is aging, that new listeners are finding his voice through screens rather than vinyl. The garden he rests in has carried almost 50 years of footsteps. The announcement is simply the moment when the people in charge finally admit that if this place is going to stand another 50, something has to change. Maybe that is why the news feels so heavy. It forces everyone who loves Elvis to face the same truth his family has lived with since 1977. Legends can feel eternal in songs and images, but the places where their bodies lie are not. Those spaces need care, boundaries, and decisions that will never please everyone. What matters in the end is whether the love that built those spaces is still honored. Right now, behind the headlines and the arguments online, there is a quiet reality inside that garden. A son rests near his parents. A daughter lies close to the father she spent her life trying to understand. Fans will still walk that path, still cry, still whisper thank you. They may stand a few steps farther back, but the story beneath their feet remains the same. Elvis has come home, and the people who guard his memory are choosing to protect that home for a future they know they will never see. If you are still listening, then Elvis is not just a legend to you, he is family. Tell me in the comments what part of his world you want uncovered next, and subscribe so you do not miss the next hidden chapter of his story still being written by us.